The lawyer's pen scratched across the paper for what must have been the 1000th time in 5 years. Thomas Wright looked up at me with concern, etched deep in his weathered face. The same expression he'd worn during every single one of our secret meetings. "Linda, are you absolutely certain about this change? This is the 4th revision this month alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I nodded firmly, my hands steady as I signed my name to yet another version of my last will and testament. Outside his office window, the Texas sun beat down mercilessly on Riverside's Main Street, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the deception I'd been living for half a decade. My son Michael believed his 68-year-old mother was slowly losing her mind to Alzheimer's disease, forgetting faces, mixing up names, and becoming increasingly dependent on his care. What he didn't know was that every single moment of confusion, every blank stare, every supposedly forgotten conversation had been a carefully orchestrated performance. The truth was far more devastating than any neurological condition could ever be. I had discovered something about my family that shattered everything I thought I knew about the people I'd raised and loved. And today, as I put the finishing touches on what would be my final will, I was about to set in motion a reckoning that would destroy some relationships forever, while hopefully saving what little authentic love remained. 5 years ago, I was Linda Thompson, recently retired elementary school teacher, a widow of 7 years, and proud mother of 2 successful adult children. My son Michael had built Thompson Construction into one of the most respected companies in Riverside, taking over the business his father started with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable work ethic. My daughter Kelly had moved to Austin with her husband Carlos, where she worked as a nurse practitioner, but she called every week and visited for holidays. Life was good. It's not perfect, certainly not without its lonely moments since Harold's passing, but good. I lived independently in the same ranch house on Oak Drive, where I'd raised my children, tended my garden, volunteered at Riverside Community Church, and enjoyed my role as grandmother to Jake and Sophia. The future stretched ahead with the comfortable predictability of golden years well earned. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2018, when I came home early from my volunteer shift at the church food bank. I'd forgotten my reading glasses and decided to swing by the house to grab them before my book club meeting. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Michael's pickup truck parked behind my Honda Civic, which struck me as odd since he hadn't mentioned planning to visit. I entered through the kitchen door, calling out to let him know I was home, but received no response. The sound of voices drifted from my home office, where I kept Harold's old desk and our important papers. Michael's voice carried clearly down the hallway, along with another voice I recognized as Rachel, his wife of 15 years. "The house alone has to be worth at least $400,000, Rachel was saying, her tone businesslike and calculating. "And that's a conservative estimate. Property values in this neighborhood have skyrocketed since they bought it." "Mom's not going anywhere anytime soon," Michael replied. But there was something in his voice that made me freeze just outside the office doorway. "She's only 63 and healthy as a horse. We could be waiting decades." "Exactly my point," Rachel continued, and I heard the distinctive sound of papers rustling. "We need to start planning now. Jake's going to need college money in just a few years, and with the way construction contracts have been lately, we can't count on the business staying this profitable forever." My heart began to pound as I realized they were going through my financial documents. The filing cabinet that Harold had always kept locked was standing open, manila folders scattered across the desktop. These weren't just casual conversations about the future. They were actively inventorying my assets like I was already dead. "Look at this life insurance policy," Rachel said with barely contained excitement. $500,000? Her teacher's pension, Social Security, and whatever she's got saved up. "Michael, your mother is worth almost $1 million. Keep your voice down," Michael hissed. But he didn't sound shocked or appalled by his wife's calculations. He sounded like a co-conspirator. "Put those papers back exactly where you found them. Mom's sharp. She'll notice if anything's out of place." I still think we should talk to her about moving into assisted living," Rachel pressed. "She doesn't need all this space, and the equity in this house could set us up for life. We could get her a nice little apartment at Peaceful Pines, somewhere safe and supervised. She'd never go for it voluntarily, Michael said, and my blood turned to ice at the implications in his tone. We'd have to find another way to convince her it's necessary. What if she started having problems? Memory issues, confusion maybe. Some accidents around the house. Nothing serious, just enough to make it clear she can't live alone safely anymore. The casual cruelty in Rachel's suggestion hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to inherit my money. They were actively scheming to manipulate me into giving up my independence and autonomy years before it would be necessary. The woman I'd welcomed into my family, whom I'd helped through her difficult pregnancy with Jake, who called me mom and brought me flowers on Mother's Day, was coolly discussing ways to gaslight me into believing I was losing my mental faculties. We can't rush it, Michael said thoughtfully. It has to look natural, gradual. Maybe start with little things. Moving stuff around when she's not looking, contradicting things she says she remembers, making her question herself. And Kelly? Rachel asked. We're going to inherit half of everything. We need to make sure she's on board with the assisted living idea when the time comes. Kelly's always been the good daughter, Michael said with a bitter edge. She'll probably fight us on it. Want to take care of mom herself? Or hire full-time? Help. We'll have to be strategic about timing things for when Kelly can't interfere. I stood paralyzed in my own hallway, listening to my son and daughter-in-law plot against me with the cold efficiency of corporate raiders. These weren't desperate people driven to extremes by financial hardship. Michael's construction business was thriving, and they lived in a beautiful home in Riverside's most exclusive neighborhood. This was pure greed, combined with a stunning lack of respect for my dignity and autonomy. The worst part wasn't even the money or the schemes. It was the realization that the son I'd raised, the boy I'd bandaged and encouraged and sacrificed for, saw me primarily as an obstacle between him and financial security. Every smile, every "how are you doing, Mom?" every seemingly caring phone call had been tainted by his secret calculations about my net worth. We should go, Rachel said, and I heard the filing cabinet drawer slide shut. She could be back any minute. I barely had time to retreat to the kitchen before they emerged from the office. Michael's face wearing the familiar mask of filial concern that I now understood was nothing but performance art. He hugged me goodbye and asked about my day with such convincing warmth that I almost wondered if I'd imagined the entire conversation. But the evidence was right there in my filing cabinet, where subtle signs of disturbance confirmed that my private papers had been thoroughly examined. Document corners not quite aligned as I'd left them. Folders in slightly different positions, even the dust patterns on the cabinet shelves disturbed by their intrusion. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, staring out at the garden Harold and I had planted together 40 years earlier. Everything I thought I knew about my family had been turned upside down in the space of 20 minutes. The son who called himself devoted was actively planning to manipulate me into institutional care for his financial benefit. The daughter-in-law I'd grown to love viewed me as nothing more than a walking inheritance. Part of me wanted to confront them immediately, to unleash the fury that burned in my chest and demand explanations for their betrayal. But another part of me, the part that had survived 6 decades of life's surprises and disappointments, recognized that knowledge was power. They didn't know I'd discovered their scheme, which meant I had the opportunity to learn just how far they were willing to go. More importantly, I needed to know if Kelly was truly innocent, or if she was simply better at hiding her involvement. My daughter had always been the more demonstrative of my children, quick with hugs and "I love you, Mom" messages. But after overhearing Michael and Rachel's conversation, I couldn't take anyone's affection at face value anymore. Over the next several weeks, I began paying closer attention to the subtle dynamics in my family relationships. Michael's visits became a source of intense anxiety as I watched for signs of the manipulation he and Rachel had discussed. Sure enough, I began noticing small discrepancies that I had previously attributed to normal middle-aged forgetfulness. My reading glasses, which I always kept on the kitchen counter, would mysteriously migrate to different rooms. Michael would reference conversations I was certain we'd never had, then look concerned when I corrected him. "Are you sure, Mom?" "I distinctly remember you saying," became a frequent refrain, delivered with just the right mixture of gentle worry, and certainty to make me second-guess my own recollections. The gaslighting was subtle, but persistent, designed to create a pattern of small confusions that would build into larger doubts about my mental acuity. If I hadn't overheard their planning session, I might have started believing I was actually experiencing early cognitive decline. The sophistication of their manipulation was almost impressive in its cruelty. Rachel's behavior became even more transparent once I knew what to look for. She would ask me the same questions multiple times during a single visit, then express concern when I became irritated by the repetition. "Mom, we just talked about this 5 minutes ago. Are you feeling all right?" she would say with perfectly performed worry, while Michael nodded gravely from across the room. They began suggesting that I might want to consider making some changes to my living situation, always framed as concern for my safety and well-being. "This house is so big, Mom. Aren't you worried about falling down the stairs? Right. Or maybe it would be good to have more people around for companionship." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Some of those senior communities are really nice these days. Each conversation felt like a chess match where only I knew the real game being played. I had to appear appropriately confused by their manufactured concerns while secretly documenting every manipulation attempt. Journal hidden in my bedroom, recording dates, times, and specific incidents of their gaslighting efforts. The hardest part was maintaining normal relationships with Jake and Sophia, my grandchildren who remained innocent of their parents' schemes. Jake, 16, and focused on basketball and video games, noticed nothing unusual in his family dynamics. But Sophia, Kelly's 12-year-old daughter, had inherited her grandmother's observant nature and occasionally asked perceptive questions about why Daddy seemed so worried about Grandma Linda lately. 3 months after my devastating discovery, Kelly came for her regular quarterly visit, bringing Sophia for a long weekend, while Carlos attended a medical conference. I watched my daughter carefully during her stay, searching for any signs that she was part of the conspiracy against me. What I found was both heartbreaking and reassuring. Kelly genuinely seemed to believe that I was beginning to show signs of cognitive decline, but her response was completely different from Michael's, where he appeared to be documenting my supposed symptoms for future use. Kelly was researching early intervention strategies and gently encouraging me to see Dr. Carter for a cognitive assessment. "Mom, I've been reading about early-stage dementia," she said during a quiet moment while Sophia played in the backyard. "There are medications now that can really slow the progression if we catch it early. And there are so many things we can do to help maintain your independence for as long as possible." The genuine love and concern in her voice was unmistakable, and I realized that Kelly was as much a victim of Michael and Rachel's manipulation as I was. They were using her natural worry about my well-being to support their narrative of my declining mental state, knowing that her medical background would lend credibility to their manufactured concerns. That night, after Kelly and Sophia had gone to bed, I made a decision that would define the next 5 years of my life. I was going to beat Michael and Rachel at their own game, but I was going to do it in a way that would expose their true nature not just to me, but to everyone who mattered. If they wanted me to appear confused and forgetful, I would give them a performance that would exceed their wildest expectations. But unlike their cruel deception, my act would serve a purpose beyond personal gain. I was going to use their own manipulation tactics to reveal the truth about their characters while protecting the family members who still deserved my love and trust. The next morning, I called Thomas Wright and scheduled my first appointment to revise my will. If Michael and Rachel wanted to play games with my mental competency, they were about to discover that this retired school teacher still had a few lessons left to teach. Thomas Wright's office became my second home over the following months. Every few weeks I would slip out during my supposed nap times and drive to his law firm where we would craft another version of my will. The changes were strategic, each revision designed to test different family members and reveal their true motivations. When they eventually learned about the modifications, the first version left everything equally between Michael and Kelly as they expected. The second version created a trust fund for Jake and Sophia's education. with specific provisions that could only be accessed if I was declared mentally incompetent. The third version donated a significant portion to Riverside Community Church, where I'd volunteered for decades. Each change was dated and witnessed, creating a paper trail that would later prove my mental competency during the entire 5-year period. But the will revisions were only part of my elaborate plan. The real challenge was perfecting my performance of cognitive decline without going so far that I'd be forced into immediate medical intervention. I studied Alzheimer's symptoms meticulously, reading medical journals and watching documentaries, to understand the progression patterns. The key was to simulate early-stage confusion while maintaining enough lucidity that I could still function independently. My first symptoms were subtle. I began occasionally calling Michael by his father's name, Harold, especially during emotional moments. The look of satisfaction that crossed his face when this happened confirmed everything I'd suspected about his intentions. Instead of gentle correction or concern, he would exchange meaningful glances with Rachel and make mental notes about my deteriorating condition. I started misplacing items more frequently, but always in ways that could be explained by simple forgetfulness rather than true cognitive impairment. My car keys would end up in the refrigerator, my purse in the laundry room. When Michael or Rachel pointed out these incidents, I would act momentarily confused before laughing it off as senior moments. They ate it up, documenting each occurrence with the enthusiasm of scientists gathering data.
The hardest part was
pretending to forget precious memories while preserving them perfectly in my mind. When Michael brought up family vacations or holidays, I would occasionally look blank and claim no recollection of events I remembered with crystal clarity. Watching his barely concealed excitement at my supposed memory loss made my stomach turn, but it also strengthened my resolve. Rachel became increasingly bold in her manipulation attempts. She would rearrange items in my house during visits, then express concern when I couldn't find things. "Mom, your coffee mug is right where you always keep it," she would say sweetly, after moving it to a completely different cabinet. "Maybe we should start labeling things to help you remember." The suggestion to label my own belongings in my own home was so patronizing that I had to bite my tongue to keep from exploding. Instead, I nodded gratefully and thanked her for being so thoughtful. The performance required Academy Award-level acting skills, especially when every instinct screamed at me to defend my competency. Dr. Helen Carter, my longtime physician, became an unwitting accomplice in my deception. During my annual checkup, I mentioned having some trouble with names and dates, carefully describing symptoms that suggested mild cognitive impairment without indicating severe dementia. Dr. Carter ordered a battery of tests, all of which I intentionally performed slightly below my normal capabilities. The cognitive assessment was particularly challenging. I had to answer questions incorrectly, just often enough to suggest decline while not failing so dramatically that I'd be referred for immediate specialized care. When asked to remember 3 words after a 5-minute interval, I would forget one of them. When drawing a clock face, I would place the numbers slightly incorrectly. Each deliberate mistake felt like a betrayal of my own intelligence. But the results served my purpose perfectly. Dr. Carter's diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment with possible early Alzheimer's disease sent shockwaves through my family, exactly as I'd intended. Michael and Rachel's response was telling in its calculation. Rather than researching treatment options or seeking second opinions, they immediately began discussing practical matters like my living situation and legal arrangements. "Mom, Dr. Carter says we need to start thinking about the future," Michael said during a family meeting he'd organized at my house. "Maybe it's time to consider giving someone power of attorney, just in case you need help making decisions later." On the audacity of his suggestion, delivered with such apparent concern, almost broke my composure. He was asking me to voluntarily hand over control of my finances and medical decisions based on a deliberately manufactured diagnosis. The fact that he saw this as an opportunity rather than a tragedy revealed everything I needed to know about his character. "I'm not ready for that yet," I replied, allowing a slight tremor into my voice. "I still feel like myself most of the time. Maybe we can revisit this in a few months." Rachel jumped in immediately. "But Mom, what if something happens and you can't make those decisions for yourself? Wouldn't it be better to have everything arranged ahead of time? Kelly, who had driven down from Austin as soon as she heard about my diagnosis, looked genuinely distressed by the entire conversation. Maybe we should focus on treatment options first, she suggested. There are new medications, cognitive therapy programs, lifestyle changes that might help slow the progression. Michael dismissed his sister's suggestions with barely concealed impatience. Kelly, we have to be realistic about this. The doctor said there's no cure, and these things only get worse over time. We need to start planning for Mom's care before she reaches the point where she can't be involved in the decisions.
Ow.
Watching Kelly's face during this exchange was heartbreaking. She clearly believed she was losing her mother to a devastating disease, while Michael saw only an opportunity to accelerate his inheritance timeline. The contrast between their responses validated my decision to protect Kelly from the truth, at least for now. The meeting ended with agreements to monitor the situation and reassess in a few months. But I could see the wheels turning in Michael and Rachel's minds. They had medical confirmation of my declining mental state, and they were already calculating their next moves. Over the following weeks, their behavior became even more manipulative. They began visiting more frequently, always with some pretext about checking on my safety or well-being. Rachel would arrive with pre-cooked meals, claiming she was worried I might forget to eat properly. Michael would show up unannounced to fix things around the house. Using these visits to assess my living conditions for signs of neglect or confusion, they started involving Jake in their deception, coaching my 16-year-old grandson to watch for signs that Grandma Linda might be having problems. The poor boy, who loved me dearly, began approaching me with the cautious concern usually reserved for fragile, elderly relatives. When he asked if I needed help remembering his friends' names or what grade he was in, I could see Michael's coaching behind the questions. The manipulation of Jake was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their scheme. They were teaching him to view his grandmother as mentally diminished, creating distance between us during what they assumed would be my final years of lucidity. Every time Jake spoke to me with that careful, patronizing tone that Michael had obviously taught him, I felt a piece of my heart break. But I also began to see opportunities within their manipulation. If they wanted to involve extended family in monitoring my condition, I could use those same relationships to gather intelligence about their true intentions. I started having confused moments during phone calls with other relatives, carefully controlling which family members heard about which symptoms. My sister Dorothy, who lived in Dallas, became particularly concerned after I called her by her late mother's name during a conversation about Christmas plans. "Linda, honey, maybe? You should come stay with me for a while," she offered. "We could take care of each other." The genuine love in Dorothy's voice stood in stark contrast to Michael and Rachel's calculated concern. When I shared Dorothy's offer with Michael, his reaction was immediate and telling. "Mom, Dallas is so far away from your doctors here," he said quickly, "and Aunt Dorothy is getting older too. What if something happened to both of you? I think you're better off staying close to family who can really help if you need it." Translation was obvious. He couldn't manipulate my medical care and living situation if I moved away from his direct influence. My supposed cognitive decline was only useful to him if he could control the narrative and timeline of my deterioration. As my first year of performance continued, I began to understand the true scope of their planning. This wasn't just about inheritance money. It was about complete control over my life and assets. They wanted to become my legal guardians, managing my finances and making all decisions about my care while I was still alive, to watch my independence disappear. The cruelest irony was that their manipulation was actually working on everyone, except me. Kelly had started researching memory care facilities just in case. Dr. Carter was adjusting my medications based on my fabricated symptoms. Even my closest friends at church were treating me with the gentle patience reserved for those whose minds were slipping away. But in Thomas Wright's office, I remained sharp, strategic, and absolutely determined to expose the truth when the time was right. Each will revision built my case for mental competency while revealing new aspects of my family's true priorities. The performance was exhausting, but it was also liberating in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time in my adult life, I was living without the burden of others' expectations. When people believed I was losing my mind, their judgment of my choices became irrelevant. I could be eccentric, unpredictable, even difficult, and everyone would attribute it to my condition rather than my character. The freedom was intoxicating, even as the isolation threatened to consume me. I was living a double life that only one person knew about, carrying the weight of my family's betrayal while performing vulnerability for their benefit. But I was also gathering evidence, building alliances, and preparing for a reckoning that would change everything. By year 3 of my performance, I had perfected the art of strategic confusion while secretly building an arsenal of evidence against Michael and Rachel. My daily routine had become a carefully choreographed dance between appearing vulnerable and gathering intelligence. Every interaction was a chess move in a game only I knew I was playing. The turning point came when Rachel made a critical mistake. She had grown so confident in my supposed mental decline that she began discussing their plans openly in my presence, assuming I was too confused to understand or remember the conversations. During one of their visits, I pretended to doze off. In my recliner, while they talked in hushed tones across my living room. "The nursing home tour is scheduled for next Tuesday," Rachel whispered to Michael. I told them we were looking for our mother who has moderate Alzheimer's. They showed me the memory care unit, and it's perfect. Private rooms are only $3,000 a month, which is nothing compared to what we'll save on our house expenses. "What did you tell them about timing?" Michael asked, his voice carrying the businesslike tone he used when discussing construction contracts. I said we were planning ahead, maybe 6 months to a year out. But honestly, I think we could move faster. She had 3 confused episodes just this week. Yesterday, she put salt in her coffee instead of sugar, and this morning she asked me twice who I was. I had to suppress a smile at that last comment. The salt incident had been a carefully planned performance, and asking about her identity was psychological warfare disguised as confusion. Watching Rachel's face when I pretended not to recognize her had been one of the few genuine pleasures in this entire ordeal. Michael leaned forward, and I could hear the excitement barely contained in his voice. "The contractor gave me an estimate on renovating this place for resale. The right updates, we could list it for $600,000, maybe more. The neighborhood is completely transformed since Mom and Dad bought here." "Have you talked to the bank about the construction loan for the house flip?" Rachel asked. "Already approved. They're treating it like a sure thing since it's essentially guaranteed by Mom's estate. The timing couldn't be better with real estate prices where they are now." The casual way they discussed profiting from my supposed incapacitation was staggering. They had already arranged financing to renovate my home for resale, toured nursing facilities, and calculated profit margins on my displacement. This wasn't opportunistic greed. It was a comprehensive business plan built on my manufactured vulnerability. But they had made one crucial error. In their eagerness to advance their timeline, they had begun leaving paper trails that I could access. Rachel had printed out information about Peaceful Pines assisted living and left it in my kitchen. Michael had received calls from contractors while visiting, discussions about the Oak Drive property renovation that he conducted within my hearing. I began my counterattack quietly, using their own tactics against them with surgical precision. When Rachel rearranged items in my house to create confusion, I would wait until she left and then move things to even more bizarre locations. If she put my reading glasses in the bathroom, I would later move them to the garden shed and mention finding them there during her next visit. "That's so strange, Mom," she would say with feigned concern. "I could have sworn I saw them in the bathroom yesterday. How did they end up outside?" "I have no idea," I would reply innocently. "I found them right next to the fertilizer. I must have been gardening and forgot to bring them back inside." The beauty of this approach was that it made Rachel question her own memory while appearing to confirm my confusion. She began double-checking her manipulation attempts, wondering if she was misremembering where she had placed items or if I was moving them unconsciously. I also started having moments of clarity that were perfectly timed to disrupt their plans. Just when they thought I was too confused to understand important conversations, I would suddenly become lucid and ask pointed questions about their discussions. "Michael, I heard you on the phone earlier talking about Oak Drive renovations," said during one visit, watching his face carefully. "Are you working on someone's house in my neighborhood?" The panic that flashed across his features was unmistakable. "Oh, that was just a potential client, Mom. Nothing definite yet." "That's nice, dear. I hope it works out for you. This neighborhood could use some investment." Property values have really grown over the years. My casual mention of property values made both Michael and Rachel exchange nervous glances. They were beginning to realize that my cognitive decline wasn't as predictable or complete as they had assumed. The moments of clarity created uncertainty about how much I actually understood about their activities. I also began dropping strategic hints about my will and estate planning designed to make them reveal their true priorities. During family dinners, I would make offhand comments about considering charitable donations or setting up education funds for the grandchildren. Their reactions were immediate and telling. "Mom, maybe we should talk about those kinds of decisions." "Together," Michael would say quickly. "Estate planning can be really complicated, and you want to make sure everything is done properly. I wouldn't want you to make any major changes without really thinking them through," Rachel would add. "Maybe we should schedule a meeting with your lawyer to review everything." Their desperate attempts to insert themselves into my financial decision-making revealed how closely they were monitoring any threats to their inheritance expectations. When I mentioned possibly donating to the church building fund, Michael actually became agitated enough to raise his voice. "Mom, that's a huge decision. The church has been around for decades. They'll be fine without your money. But your family needs to know you're secure for the future." The mask was slipping. The caring son routine became harder for him to maintain when he perceived direct threats to his financial interests. I began pushing these boundaries more frequently, watching him struggle to balance fake concern with real greed. Meanwhile, I was secretly documenting everything. Hidden in my bedroom closet was a detailed journal of their manipulation attempts, complete with dates, times, and direct quotes. I had also begun recording some of our conversations using a small digital recorder that Thomas Wright had suggested. The device was tiny enough to conceal in my pocket, and the audio quality was clear enough to capture their exact words. The recordings were devastating. I had captured Rachel discussing nursing home costs while I pretended to sleep. I had Michael on tape talking to contractors about renovating the inheritance property. Most damaging of all, I had recorded them coaching Jake on how to monitor my behavior and report concerning incidents. "Just keep an eye on Grandma when you're here," Michael told his 16-year-old son during one visit. "If she seems confused or forgets things, make sure to mention it to us. Need to know if she's getting worse." The manipulation of Jake remained the most heartbreaking aspect of their scheme, but it also provided some of my strongest evidence. They were actively teaching a child to spy on his grandmother and report her vulnerabilities for their exploitation. As I built my case against them, I also began reaching out to allies who could help expose the truth when the time came. My neighbor Maggie Walsh had become suspicious of Michael and Rachel's frequent visits and their increasingly controlling behavior toward me. Without revealing my secret, I began confiding in her about feeling pressured to make decisions I wasn't ready for. "They keep talking about me moving somewhere safer," I told Maggie during one of our coffee sessions on her porch. "But I love my house. I raised my children there, and Harold and I plan to live there for the rest of our lives." "Linda, honey, you seem as sharp as ever to me," Maggie replied with characteristic directness. "If you don't want to move, then don't move. You're not their prisoner." Maggie's straightforward support was a lifeline during the most difficult periods of my performance. She had known me for 20 years, and wasn't fooled by occasional moments of manufactured confusion. Her perspective helped validate my belief that my true personality was still evident to people who really knew me. I also cultivated a relationship with Maria Santos, the caregiver that Michael and Rachel had insisted on hiring despite my protests. They claimed it was for my safety, but I knew it was really for surveillance. Maria was supposed to report on my daily activities and mental state, providing them with ammunition for their incompetency case. But Maria was a compassionate woman who genuinely cared about her clients. Instead of treating me like a surveillance target, she engaged me in real conversations and activities. I began selectively dropping my confused act around her, allowing glimpses of my true mental acuity to show through. "Mrs. Thompson, you seem different when your son isn't here," Maria observed during one of our sessions. "More yourself." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "When it's just us, you remember everything perfectly. You solve crossword puzzles. You cook complex recipes. You even help me with my English homework for community college. But when Mr. Michael visits, suddenly you can't remember what day it is." Maria's observation was both a validation and a warning. If she could see through my performance, others might as well. But it also presented an opportunity. Maria was becoming an unwitting witness to my true mental state, someone who could testify to my competency if needed. The third year of my deception had transformed me from a victim of manipulation into an active strategist, planning my own counterattack. I had evidence, allies, and a growing understanding of exactly how far Michael and Rachel were willing to go in their exploitation of my supposed vulnerability. But I also knew that the most dangerous phase was approaching. They were becoming impatient with the timeline of my decline and increasingly bold in their manipulation attempts. Soon, they would move from subtle pressure to direct action, and when they did, I would be ready to turn their own weapons against them in ways they never saw coming. The explosive confrontation that would expose everything began on a rainy Thursday morning in November, 4.5 years into my elaborate charade. Michael arrived at my house earlier than usual, accompanied not just by Rachel but also by a woman I didn't recognize wearing a professional suit and carrying a leather briefcase. "Mom, this is Sandra Martinez from Adult Protective Services," Michael announced with what he probably thought was appropriate solemnity. "We've asked her to come talk with you about some concerns we've been having." The audacity of involving social services in their scheme represented a new level of manipulation that even I hadn't anticipated. They were essentially trying to have me declared legally incompetent through official channels, using a government agency to legitimize their fabricated concerns about my mental state. Sandra Martinez was a kind-faced woman in her 40s who clearly took her job seriously. She sat across from me in my living room, clipboard in hand, while Michael and Rachel positioned themselves like prosecutors presenting evidence against a defendant. "Mrs. Thompson, your family has expressed some worries about your ability to live independently," Sandra began gently. "They've mentioned incidents where you've seemed confused or forgotten important things. I'm here to assess whether you might benefit from additional support services." I knew this was the moment I had been preparing for during the past 4 years. Everything I had documented, recorded, and strategically planned was leading to this confrontation. But I also knew I had to be careful about how I revealed the truth. Sandra Martinez was an innocent professional doing her job. She didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of family warfare. "What kinds of incidents are they referring to?" I asked, allowing just a hint of confusion to color my voice while watching Michael and Rachel's faces carefully. "Well, they've mentioned that you sometimes forget conversations, misplace important items, and have had some trouble managing daily tasks," Sandra replied, consulting her notes. "They're concerned about your safety living alone in such a large house." Michael leaned forward eagerly. "Just last week, she left the stove on all night. And yesterday, she called me Harold, which was my father's name. She seems to think he's still alive sometimes." The stove incident was completely fabricated, and the name confusion had been a deliberate performance designed to gauge his reactions. But hearing him present these lies to a government official as fact made my blood boil. This wasn't just family manipulation anymore. This was fraud involving public agencies. "Mrs. Thompson, can you tell me about your daily routine?" Sandra asked. "How do you manage things like cooking, cleaning, managing your medications?" I decided it was time to begin revealing the truth, but I needed to do it strategically. "Miss Martinez, may I ask exactly what my son and his wife have told you about my condition? Because I think there may be some misunderstandings that need to be cleared up." Something in my tone made Sandra look more carefully at me. "They've indicated that you've been experiencing progressive memory loss and confusion over the past several years, consistent with early-stage dementia." "I see," I replied, my voice becoming clearer and more focused with each word. "And did they mention that I've been secretly meeting with my lawyer every few weeks for the past 4 years to revise my will? Or that I've been keeping detailed records of their manipulation attempts? Or that I have recordings of them discussing plans to commit me to memory care so they can sell my house?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sandra's pen stopped moving across her clipboard. Michael's face went white, then red. then white again. Rachel actually gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized the implications of what I had just revealed. Mom, what are you talking about? Michael stammered, but his voice lacked any conviction. You've been confused lately? Maybe you're mixing up some dreams with reality. I stood up from my chair with the steady grace of someone whose mind was perfectly intact and walked to my bookshelf. From behind a row of novels, I retrieved the digital recorder I had hidden there before their arrival. Would you like to hear some of those dreams, Michael? I asked, holding up the device. Like the one where you and Rachel discussed how much money you'd make renovating my house after putting me in Peaceful Pines? Or the one where you coached Jake to spy on my behavior and report back to you? Isel found her voice first, though it came out as a panicked whisper. Linda, we were just trying to help you. We were worried about your safety. Help me. I laughed, and there was nothing confused or frail about the sound. You were helping yourselves to my assets while I was still alive to watch. You convinced a 16-year-old boy to monitor his grandmother for signs of weakness. You forged a medical narrative about my mental decline and presented it to social services as fact. Sandra Martinez had been scribbling furiously in her notes, but now she looked up with the expression of someone who had just realized she was witnessing something far more complex than a routine competency assessment. Mrs. Thompson, she said carefully, are you saying that you've been deliberately appearing confused or forgetful? For 4 years and 7 months, I confirmed, overheard Michael and Rachel planning to manipulate me into believing I had dementia so they could force me into institutional care and gain access to my finances. So I decided to give them exactly what they wanted to see, while documenting every single manipulation attempt they made. I walked to my bedroom and returned with the journal I had been keeping, along with a folder of printed emails, financial documents, and photographs. Ms. Martinez, everything is documented here. Dates, times, specific incidents of gaslighting and emotional manipulation. I also have recordings of them discussing their plans when they thought I was too confused too. Understand, Michael made one last desperate attempt to maintain his narrative. Mom, this is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that we've been worried about. You're having delusions about family members plotting against you. This is a classic symptom of cognitive decline, but Sandra Martinez was no fool. She had spent years working with families in crisis, and she could recognize genuine concern versus calculated manipulation. The evidence I was presenting, combined with the dramatic shift in my demeanor and cognitive clarity, painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Mr. Thompson, Sandra said firmly, I'm going to need to speak with your mother privately, and I think we need to schedule a comprehensive evaluation with a geriatric psychiatrist to assess her actual mental state. That won't be necessary, I said calmly. I've already arranged for an independent psychological evaluation with Dr. Patricia Wells at Houston Methodist. The appointment is next Tuesday. I'm confident the results will confirm that I've been mentally competent throughout this entire ordeal. It's the revelation that I had been proactive about seeking professional validation of my mental state was the final nail in Michael and Rachel's coffin. They had built their entire scheme on the assumption that I was either genuinely impaired or too confused to defend myself effectively. The reality that I had been strategically planning my own vindication left them with no credible response. Rachel began crying, but they weren't tears of remorse for the pain they had caused. They were tears of someone whose carefully constructed plan had just collapsed around them. We really thought you were sick, she said through her sobs. We're just trying to prepare for the future. No, I replied with quiet fury. You were trying to steal my future, saw my supposed vulnerability as an opportunity for profit, not a tragedy requiring compassion. You turned my grandson into an unwitting spy and convinced my daughter that her mother was losing her mind. You've contacted social services to have me declared incompetent based on lies and manufactured evidence. Michael's shock was giving way to anger as he realized the full scope of my deception. You let us believe you were dying, he accused. Do you have any idea what that put us through? What it put you through? The hypocrisy of his complaint was breathtaking. Michael, I listened to you calculate my net worth like I was already dead. I watched you coach your own son to monitor my behavior for exploitation opportunities. I've spent 4 years pretending to be confused while you systematically tried to gaslight me into believing I was losing my mind. Sandra Martinez had heard, "Enough. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to need you to leave now. I'll be filing a report about this incident. And there may be further investigation into the false claims you've made to this agency." As Michael and Rachel gathered their things to leave, I could see the wheels turning in Michael's mind. He was already trying to figure out how to salvage the situation, how to spin this revelation to minimize the damage to his reputation and financial prospects. "Mom, we can work this out," he said as he reached the door. "This has all been a big misunderstanding. Maybe we can sit down as a family and talk through everything." "There's nothing to work out," I replied firmly. "You've shown me exactly who you are when you thought I couldn't defend myself. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a revelation." After they left, Sandra Martinez spent another hour with me reviewing the documentation I had compiled and asking detailed questions about my experience. By the end of our conversation, she was satisfied that I was not only mentally competent, but had been the victim of a sophisticated manipulation scheme. "Mrs. Thompson, what you've endured is a form of elder abuse," she said as she prepared to leave. "Have you considered pursuing legal action against them?" "I've considered many things," I replied. "But first, I have one more family member who deserves to know the truth." 3 days after Sandra Martinez left my house, I called Kelly and asked her to come to Riverside immediately. I told her it was urgent, but didn't explain why over the phone. My daughter's voice carried the familiar undertone of worry that had become constant since my fake diagnosis. And I knew that revealing the truth to her would be both a relief and a devastating blow. Kelly arrived that evening with Carlos and Sophia, their faces etched with concern about what medical emergency might have prompted my urgent call. When they walked into my living room and saw me sitting calmly with a cup of tea, looking more alert and composed than I had in years, Kelly's first response was visible confusion. "Mom, you look different," she said cautiously. "Better somehow. Did Dr. Carter change your medication?" "Sit down, sweetheart," I said gently. "I have something to tell you that's going to be very difficult to hear, but I need you to listen to the whole story before you react." For the next 2 hours, I walked Kelly through the entire 5-year deception. I showed her my hidden journals, played selected recordings of Michael and Rachel's conversations, explained how I had discovered their scheme to manipulate me into assisted living for their financial gain. Watch my daughter's face cycle through disbelief, horror, anger, and finally, a deep sadness that broke my heart. "You mean you've been fine this whole time?" Kelly whispered, her voice cracking. "I spent years grieving for you while you were still alive. I researched dementia care. I cried myself to sleep thinking about losing my mother's mind before her body." "I know," I said, reaching for her hand. "And I'm sorry you had to go through that pain. But Kelly, you were never part of their scheme. Your grief was real, your love was real, and your response to my supposed illness showed me everything I needed to know about your character." Carlos, who had remained silent throughout my revelation, finally spoke up. "Linda, this is incredible. The planning, the acting, the documentation. You built a legal case while living a complete lie for 5 years." "It wasn't a lie," I corrected him. "It was survival. Michael and Rachel were going to destroy my autonomy and independence based on manufactured evidence. I had to fight back with the only weapon I had, their own assumptions about my vulnerability." Sophia, now 17 and sharp enough to understand the implications of what she'd heard, looked stunned. "Grandma, does this mean Uncle Michael was trying to steal from you?" "Uncle Michael and Aunt Rachel were planning to control my life. And assets for their own benefit?" I explained carefully. "They convinced themselves it was justified because they thought I wouldn't live much longer anyway. But what they were really doing was stealing my right to make my own decisions about my own life." Kelly was still processing the enormity of what I had revealed. "What happens now? What are you going to do about Michael and Rachel?" "I've already done it," I said, pulling out a manila envelope from the side table. "Yesterday, I filed the final version of my will with Thomas Wright. Michael and Rachel will receive exactly what they deserve for their behavior." Kelly's eyes widened. "Mom, what does that mean?" "It means that Michael will inherit this house as he always expected," I said calmly. "But there are conditions. The inheritance is contingent on him publicly acknowledging his manipulation attempts and making amends to everyone he involved in his deception. If he refuses, his portion goes entirely to charity. And Rachel gets nothing, I continued. She's not my blood relative, and she's shown herself to be someone who views family relationships as financial opportunities. I've also established education trusts for Jake and Sophia that Michael and Rachel cannot access, ensuring their college expenses are covered regardless of their parents' financial decisions. Carlos leaned back in his chair, looking impressed. Despite the gravity of the situation, you've essentially forced Michael to choose between his inheritance and his pride. More than that, I said. I've forced him to confront the consequences of his actions in a way that can't be ignored or rationalized. He can claim the inheritance and admit his wrongdoing, or he can maintain his innocence and lose everything he was trying to steal. Kelly was quiet for a long moment, then asked the question I had been dreading. What about us? What about our relationship? How do I trust you again after 5 years of lies? The pain in her voice cut through me like a knife. This was the cost I had always known I would have to pay for my deception. Even though Kelly had been an innocent victim of Michael's manipulation, she was also a casualty of my own necessary deceit. I don't know if you can trust me again, I admitted. I made a choice to protect myself and expose the truth, but that choice required lying to everyone, including people who didn't deserve to be lied to. You have every right to be angry with me. I'm not angry, Kelly said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I'm heartbroken. I grieved for you, Mom. I planned for a future where I would watch you fade away piece by piece. I made career decisions based on eventually becoming your caregiver. And all that time, you were fine. Sophia moved to sit beside her mother, taking Kelly's hand in a gesture that reminded me painfully of my own relationship with Kelly at that age. Mom, Grandma was protecting herself from people who wanted to hurt her. Sometimes people have to do things that seem wrong to stop worse things from happening. Out of the mouths of teenagers came wisdom that adults often struggled to find. Sophia understood something that would take Kelly much longer to process, that moral choices in family conflicts are rarely clean or simple. Kelly, I said softly, I can't undo the pain my deception caused you, but I can promise you this. From now on, there will be no more lies between us, no more performances, no more hidden agendas, just the relationship between a mother and daughter, who love each other enough to work through even the most complicated truths. We talked until nearly midnight, working through the emotions and implications of my revelation. Kelly needed time to process everything, and I understood that our relationship would be different going forward. The trust that had been damaged might never be fully repaired, but perhaps we could build something new on the foundation of complete honesty. 3 weeks later, Michael called to tell me he was contesting the will. He claimed I had been mentally incompetent during the time I was revising it, despite all evidence to the contrary. The independent psychological evaluation had confirmed my complete mental competency. But Michael was apparently willing to spend his own money on legal fees rather than admit his wrongdoing. That's his choice, I told Thomas Wright when he informed me of Michael's decision. He's choosing his pride over his inheritance, just as he chose greed over his relationship with his mother. The legal battle would take months to resolve, but I wasn't worried about the outcome. The evidence of my competency was overwhelming. Michael's own recorded words would eventually destroy any case he tried to build. As I sit here now, 6 months after the truth came out, I can honestly say I have no regrets about my 5-year performance. I lost a son, but I discovered he had never really been the person I thought he was. I damaged my relationship with Kelly, but I also revealed the depth of her genuine love and character. I gave up 5 years of authentic living, but I preserved my autonomy and dignity in ways that would have been impossible through any other means. The price of truth is often higher than the cost of lies, but it's a price worth paying when the alternative is surrendering your life to people who see you as nothing more than an obstacle to their own prosperity. I may be 73 years old now. I'm finally free to live the remainder of my life on my own terms, surrounded by people who love me for who I am rather than what I'm worth. And sometimes, that freedom is worth any sacrifice required to achieve it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.